I was delivering and installing machines for the company I worked for. Since I was behind schedule, I decided to drive late to my next destination. There were no streetlights in the general area and no other cars at the time. I was in a big box truck with 12 machines in the back. I was having trouble with the truck the day before, so I had it checked out by the rental company, and they said it was all good. At the peak of feeling like I was in the middle of nowhere, every single light on the dashboard of the truck lit up, and then it stalled. Now it's pitch black. I am stopped and the truck isn't restarting. Rather than eat up the battery trying to turn it over, I shut everything down and started making phone calls. As I was calling everyone and anyone that would listen, I sat in the dark night, with the only light being from my hazard lights. I looked up and saw something move in front of the truck, just out of distance from the flashing lights. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I finally got a hold of someone, and they told me it would be 2 to 3 hours before they could get a mechanic to me. So now I am sitting in silence. The only noise is the clicking the hazard lights are making, and I am staring out the windshield into a void of darkness when I see movement again. Just as I was about to poop my pants, my phone rang, and that nearly secured the pants pooping because it scared the hell out of me. It was a mechanic who wanted me to get out, open the hood, and check some things out. I told him I was not getting out of the truck with an explanation as to why. He was irritated with me, but I didn't care. So finally, after seeing the movement just out of range of the lights one more time, I threw on the headlights with the high beams. The headlights caught 3 wolves snacking on something that looked like roadkill. I honked the horn, and they looked at me like they were irritated more than scared. I was safe. The wolves, more than likely, weren't going to bother me, but it was spooky just knowing they were there. So I shut the lights off. I would turn the lights on occasionally to check to see if they were still there. I was basically just sitting there, listening to the hazard flashes click, while surfing my phone. Each time I turned the lights on, the wolves were still there. Just to remind you, I am in the middle of nowhere. There are no homes, no business, nothing but trees, wilderness, and wolves. I suddenly heard what I could only equate to a woman's scream of terror that sounded like it came from right behind the truck. Then, something slammed into the side of the truck. I was rattled as it was hard enough to rock it. I wasn't afraid of the truck tipping over, but whatever hit it hard enough to rock the suspension enough to move me around in the cab. It was a pretty heavy truck. I turned every light that the truck had on. I slipped it into reverse so the reverse lights came on and laid on the horn. I was checking both mirrors, and the only thing I saw was a shadow bolt across the road. I couldn't make out what it technically was, but in my head, it was a werewolf, yeti, Bigfoot lizard monster that was going to end my life, and it was going to be agonizingly painful the entire time. I also noticed the wolves were gone. From every nature documentary I've watched, the only time predators leave food is when there are bigger and worse predators around. Whatever it was, I didn't want to be at the bottom of that food chain. My mind and all my senses were dialed up to 11 now. Whatever crossed the road didn't cross very far off. I could hear it thrashing around in the brush, breaking sticks and what sounded to be logs. There was no noise pollution. I only had my window cracked a little bit, and I could hear pretty well. I basically had the steering wheel gripped and had all the lights on. I was feverishly looking out the windows and through the mirrors to make sure nothing was around the immediate area of the truck. I couldn't see off the road, and the flashlights I had were in the back of the truck in my tool bag. I'd have to get out of the truck to get to them. Finally, I saw some headlights through one of my mirrors. It seemed like it took hours for them to close the distance to me. The noise stopped as the headlights approached. It was obviously the mechanic because no one else was stupid enough to be out there besides me. The mechanic pulled out in front of me. My headlights were shining on him and his truck. As his door opened to step out, we both heard the sound of the woman screaming in terror again, and the brush thrashing intensified. Whatever it was still close and pissed. His door immediately closed and my phone rang. He called my phone asking me what it was. He sounded more panicked than me. I had no clue what it was, and he had no clue what it was. I think he then understood why I didn't want to step out of the truck, so the mechanic called the police. He wouldn't work on my truck until we could secure the area, which I don't blame him. He didn't like my idea of him getting out of his truck just to check things out. 2 Michigan State police officers showed up. They lit that area up like it was a stadium. I finally stepped out of the truck for the first time since it all started. We heard that scream 3 more times while the mechanic was working on my truck. Thankfully, they were getting further away. The cops heard it and had no clue what it was either. They were kind of spooked too. The mechanic finally got my truck running, and I made it to my hotel for the night. The next morning I walked the truck for inspection, and I saw the side that was hit. There was an indentation about the size of a basketball. Whatever hit it didn't hit it hard enough to push all the way through, but it definitely mushed the fiberglass. The indentation was about 7 feet off the ground. I have no idea what it was. I probably never will. I do confidently know that I will never ever drive through the Upper Peninsula at night again. This story never ceases to give me goosebumps. During my sophomore year of high school, my girlfriend and I were headed to the school dance. We lived in a small Texas town. For reference, my graduating class was 120. I was 15 at the time, so I was still not driving. She picked me up, and we got dinner. The meal went by faster than we expected, so we had about an hour to kill. We were driving on the back roads that were near her house, and she told me she had found the perfect makeout spot. So, of course, my hormonal brain didn't think about just how illegal or dangerous it was to trespass in the middle of nowhere. We pulled into a driveway, or what used to be one. The road was covered with gravel for about 40 feet and then turned to dirt. The dirt road was extremely overgrown with grass, and it appeared to have not been used in many years. There was a field to the left of us and a densely wooded area to the right. 3 large gravel piles were between us and the woods. When she pulled in, she pulled the car around to face the exit. It was such a trivial thing, yet it made all the difference. There was no one around, and the mood was set. She shut the car off, and we hopped into the back seat, quickly getting down to business. About an hour goes by, and we're about ready to hit the road. While we're getting dressed, she looks at me and says that she really has to pee. At this point, my hormones are back under control, and I'm slowly realizing just how sketchy this place is. It's pitch black, the car is off, and all of our doors are unlocked. Does she mean right now? We're in the middle of nowhere, and I don't think it's a good idea. She was a stubborn girl, which might have had something to do with why we're not together anymore. I see her reaching for the door handle. I've had a few cinematic moments in my life, but the way that she reached for the door is something I'll never forget. Her hand moved so slowly, as if she was waiting for something to happen. Just as her fingertips touched the handle, a crisp knocking noise comes from the back of the car. It was most certainly the sound of knuckles tapping against the top of the trunk. Keep in mind that there are no trees or anything that could have been making this noise on the car. It was a perfect rhythm of knuckles on metal for about 10 seconds. My girlfriend and I sat dead still, holding on to each other, neither of us even breathing. After the longest 10 seconds of my life, the knocking stops. I attempted to look out the window to see if I could see anyone or anything, but I could hardly even see my girlfriend's face right in front of mine. It was dead silent. We didn't even hear any footsteps approaching us in the first place. "What in the world was that?" she asked me. "I don't know. Just start the car," I said. My hands were trembling, and I could hear the fear in my own voice. "Babe, please start the car," I asked one more time. "I can't move," she replied. The second she was quiet, the knocking started again. It was the same rhythmic beating that I can still remember perfectly. I had enough. In the course of the next 3 seconds, I was able to jump in the front seat, start the car, lock the doors, turn on the headlights, and put my seatbelt. I'm amazed that I was still able to think of road safety at that moment. I floored that Toyota Corolla like I was a professional NASCAR driver. I hit about 50 on the turnout of that driveway, spewing gravel on whatever was behind me. I drove like a madman for about 2 miles down the road and stopped at an electric plant down the road. My girlfriend got out to use the bathroom, and I sat in the front seat, my whole body still shaking. I got dressed and we drove the rest of the way in silence. That was the first time I had driven a car outside of a parking lot. Once we got to the dance, we just sat in the corner. I have no idea what we even said to each other about it. I just knew that I was never going back to that place, or so I thought. Near the end of the dance, one of my best friends came up to me, and I explained to him what had happened. "We've got to go back," he said. I couldn't believe my ears. This guy wants to go check it out. The next day, around noon, he picked me up, and we went back to the spot. If he didn't believe me the night before, he definitely did now. I got a good look at the spot, just as I remembered it the night before. Now I could definitely see how secluded it really was. There were no houses or buildings within sight of this place. The driveway was not there anymore. I walked up to where the tire marks were from the night before, still fresh in the gravel. I grimaced as I noticed boot prints leading up to the back of the marks. 2 prints, side by side, right behind the back left tire. The prints came from and returned to the overgrown brush. My friend could tell I was pretty uncomfortable, so we decided to head out. A couple of months went by, and me and my girlfriend broke up over unrelated matters. We attend different colleges now, but sometimes she will come and visit some high school friends who attend my school. I saw her last semester. We caught up for a while, just about life and all that good stuff. During a lull in the conversation, I asked her, "Do you ever think about that time?" She put her hand up, her smile gone from her face. "I don't think about it, ever. And I don't want to." And that was the end of that. My most common run is Vancouver to San Francisco. It's an easy trip most of the time with very little challenge involved. I tend to prefer driving into the night because there's less traffic. Of course, driving around in the middle of nowhere during witching hour means I've seen my share of things. There were UFOs and Bigfoot sightings here and there, but none of that stuff has ever scared me nearly as bad as the people you see walking along the shoulder of the road far from civilization. I noticed my first one on my junior run down south on the number 5. It was a lady in a blue summer dress just strolling down the side of the highway underneath the full moon. She's there without a care in the world. Now we were on a stretch that was miles and miles away from anything in either direction, and I was the first vehicle on the road that she'd likely seen since dusk. She didn't even look up to acknowledge me, though. Instead, she just kept on walking with a sort of vacant smile. I chalked it up to some hippie from the Oregon Trail, hopped up on something from a nearby campsite, and kept driving. But she was only the first. It's not every trip you spot them, but sometimes you see a few on a single go. It always struck me as strange because you never seem to see them during the day, or maybe you do, but they don't stick out as much under the sun. Even so, once you know they're there, you'll start noticing the hell out of them whenever you're driving far from civilization in the dark. The other truckers call them moon wanders, but I prefer shoulder walkers, since that's always where they are. Almost like trains on a track, they walk that little white line to wherever they're going. They're different shapes and sizes too. They're men, women, tall, fat, thin, or pretty. Just folks like you'd see anywhere. Sure, they're creepy, but for a long time I didn't pay them any mind beyond noticing them on occasion in the split second that they were visible as I cruised past. But one night a few months ago, I passed by what looked like an old lady. She was in a hospital gown and looked just like someone on death row. She had sunken, given up on life sort of eyes, frizzy white hair and pale skin. She was smiling just like her grandkids had called her name. Her pace was a slow shuffle along the shoulder, and just looking at her, I could imagine the sound of her hospital slippers running just over top the gravelly road. I wanted to keep driving because, well, to be honest, she gave me the willies. She also reminded me of my own sweet grandma, God rest her soul. So I brought my rig to a slow stop and, collecting up the flashlight I keep in my glove box, stepped out of the cab. I could hear her coming before I could see her as I'd driven a few meters ahead of her due to the long stop time. Her feet made gentle scraping sounds on the road. I could visualize her wrinkly feet in those hospital slippers shuffling ever onward. Quickly, I checked the Maps app on my phone and saw that the closest town to where we were was over 50 miles. There's no way this old lady was walking that. Putting my phone in my jeans, I held up my flashlight and started walking towards the sound of her footfalls. I called out to her politely, hoping that she would speak up. There was no luck, and I just heard more scraping. My hairs were on edge now as I waited for her to enter into the dim light of my flashlight. I nearly cried out as the ghostly appearance came into view. It's not because anything was different from before, just because she looked so much more sickly up close. I asked her, "Ma'am, are you okay? You're in the middle of nowhere, you know." She didn't say anything. She just kept smiling and moving steadily forward. Now my heart was beating hard. I thought that she badly needed help, as she was obviously senile. But my feet were frozen in place. They were going back to the truck, or they weren't moving at all. She was getting closer, though, and as she reached within 10 feet or so, her wrinkled hands began to reach slowly up. Her fingers wiggled in my direction like a grandma reaching for her grandchild's face. She opened her mouth but didn't say anything, just grinned at me with pale gums. My legs gave out, and, as I fell onto my side, she reached down for me with surprising speed and dexterity. Before I knew what was going on, she had her bony fingers around my ankles, and I was getting dragged down the road. Desperately, I pulled back, but her grip was superhuman. Surprisingly, the addition of my weight didn't seem to slow her walk in the least. She stared down at me with those beady, sunken eyes, mouth agape in a smile. I kicked at her with all the fight I had in me, and luckily connected with her jaw. To my horror, it was like kicking solid concrete, but luckily she let go despite having no visible injury. I crawled backwards towards the middle of the road, and she kept walking down the shoulder. Her hands fell back down to her side, and her mouth closed into a tight-lipped smile. But her gaze stayed locked on mine as she slowly shuffled out of my flashlight's beam. I waited as the scraping bit by bit faded from my ears, and after what ended up being a half hour of stunned silence, I worked up the nerve to get up and go back to my rig. There's no sign of the lady, but when I climbed into my cab and sped down the highway, it didn't take long to catch up with her. Her eyes were still stuck on me. They probably had been the whole time as she walked away. The last I saw of her as I gunned it away was her thin, chapped, smirking lips. According to some other guys I know, I'm the first to try and interact with a shoulder walker, and if God is good, it will be the last. Since then, I've seen plenty more, strolling down the highway in the pitch dark. I even saw a kid once, but there ain't no way I'm ever stopping again for them. And if you're smart, you won't either. Since that night, it feels like the shoulder walkers are always looking right at me when I drive past, which they never used to do. Almost like since that old lady saw me, they all did. I'd hate to think what would have happened if I'd not managed to get free. But I can rest easy, knowing I've put my warning out there in public. Maybe I'll save a few folks with this story. Please drop a like and subscribe to Eerie Echoes for more horror stories. As always, thank you for watching.